Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. Hopefully you may have seen episode 1 of this ongoing series about historiography, which I'm doing sort of in conjunction with an event called Historathon2024. You certainly don't have to be participating in that event to be able to appreciate this series of videos, but I figured that some of the people that are reading for that event might like this as sort of a supplemental way, set of things to think about as they read throughout the year. Again, these videos will be based pretty closely on the chapters in this book, Ernst Breisach's Historiography, Ancient, Medieval, and Modern. And today is episode 2, the Greek birth pangs of historiography. Histories, it's right in the word, are stories. And the first stories were composed as epic poetry, either through original composition or by cobbling together some pre-existing material. The first bards or rhapsodes were fascinated by the gods and the heroes, their glories, and their great deeds. Epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey would sometimes touch on the vicissitudes of human relationships. Think of, for example, Odysseus' reunion with Penelope and Telemachus at the end of the Odyssey. But at their core, they aimed for what the Greek poets thought to be something higher, grander, and more ennobling. That is, the lives and deeds of heroes, gods, and demigods. And to complement this sense of grandiosity, epics were not spoken in everyday prosaic language like I'm speaking to you now, but they were sung, often to music, in dactyls, specifically dactylic hexameter. This mode of communication simultaneously increased the reverence of the audience, perhaps in a similar way that watching opera does today to contemporary viewers. But because these stories were first orally communicated, it also provided an attempt for the rhapsodes, or the poets, to adjust and modulate their messages or preferences with the exigencies of local Greek life. Notice how the actions of the Iliad do not create a chronology in the sense that we would recognize today of the Trojan War, but they condense it down to a few weeks, relegating a lot of the action to mere flashbacks. What drew in listeners then and now were not the mundane details of battles, but the passions, the strengths, the actions, and the moral code of its protagonist, Achilles, along with other people like Patroclus, the suffering of Greek nobles who were with them and around them, and the conniving of the gods as they used the Greeks and Trojans as their human pawns. While epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey among them, did pay attention to the fates of individuals, they never consider the collective fates of human beings, of societies, of cultures, of civilizations. The entire Odyssey proceeds like the fate of the Achaeans was able to be dismissed, with the center of attention remaining on the deeds of, like I said, the heroes, gods, and demigods. There is no desire from these early poets to recite narratives about the mundane events of festivals or public gatherings or the daily toils of farmers. Audiences came to be inspired, to be put in a sense of awe, and to bask in the presence of something they thought to be greater than themselves. Above all, they came to be educated. This is in a culture where entertainment and didacticism were inextricably linked together much like Philip Sidney suggests many centuries later in his essay in defense of poesy. It wasn't until the time of Hesiod, active about a century or two after Homer, that is, if in fact Homer was a historical person or persons, that we begin to see a different view of the past. Hesiod's theogony still takes up gods and gods as its subjects, but he imbues the cosmos with a kind of order that we don't see in Homer. For Hesiod, he's one of the writers in which we might call the West, the beginning of the Greek tradition, who would invent a patterned history for all collective human beings, not just gods and heroes. Namely, that history is the five-staged cycle that you might be familiar with, which begins with a golden age, marked by a lack of suffering or pain. Note the very marked resemblance here with the biblical concept of Eden that you see in Genesis. The Silver Age, marked by cruelty and war. The Bronze Age, with heroes of immense physical strength that destroyed themselves with even more war. The Age of Heroes, which is full of heroes and demigods. This is the age that Homer himself is writing about. And finally, the Age of Iron, which is full of misery, ignorance, suffering, and death. Here you have not stories about heroes and gods, but a general pattern which subsumes even the most ordinary person in an all-encompassing historical process. Noticeably, you can tell this is a process of declination, decadence, and decline. From a golden age to a state of death, pain, and suffering. Several centuries later, Ovid would develop a highly parallel philosophy of history in his Metamorphoses, in 4 stages instead of Hesiod's 5, eliding the stage of heroes. In Hesiod and Ovid, we see that history acquires not just a sense of order, but a sense of direction with a distinct teleology. After around 800 BC, the autonomous Greek polis became an increasingly popular way to govern people in ancient Greece. And as the polis got bigger and they became more numerous, Greeks eventually began to interact more with a wider world of non-Greeks. And this too, of course, has a variety of intellectual consequences. One of the first identifiable philosophers from the Greek tradition, who goes by the name of Thales of Miletus, working in the 6th century BC, posits a world that is not based on heroes or gods and isn't even based around human beings. He sought out what he thought was or were the underlying substances that constituted everything in the universe. Thales thought that this originating substance was water. Other people had different opinions. Anaximenes, for example, thought that it was air, etc. It wasn't until more than 2 centuries later, with the arrival of the Greek sophists in the philosophical tradition, that philosophy begins to take up what we might call human concerns, like ethics. But the birth of the polis and increasing Greek colonization necessitated new and innovative ways to map both time and space. Whereas Homeric epics give no dates, happening only at indeterminate places in the past, Greeks eventually started to use the concept of generations to lay out a rough system of the passage of time. One of our earliest Greek historians, by the name of Hecataeus of Miletus, used the time period of the generation in his work Genealogies to fill in large gaps of time that existed in Homer's epics, and thereby make a gigantic leap forward in making history more human-centered. In the 5th century, an historian by the name of Hellenicus of Lesbos used generations to date the Trojan War to about the year 1240 BC. In his Attic history, Hellenicus introduced the names of specific people, especially religious officers and winners of important athletic games like the Carnean Games, to denote specific time periods. This trend led to myriad other ways of chronicling time. Hippias of Elis used the Olympic victors, and others would use the ephors of Sparta or the archons of Athens. And this, of course, leaves you with a mass of names, most of whom were meant to denote various lengths of time, which is very confusing. How do you use all of these chronologies that use different markers and denote various amounts of time to create a coherent idea of history? Because one historian uses one marker, another historian uses another. How do you possibly go about making sense of any of this? And that is a question I want to pick up with in episode 3, which I will call Two Greek Giants, Herodotus and Thucydides. Until next time.